Okay, good afternoon. So this week we're going to talk about postmodern theories, and actually we could say that last week with solution focus, that was a step towards postmodern. Some people put them in the camp of postmodern approaches. I'm going to share with you some of the ideas that I have about postmodernism, but it's a little intimidating because I also know that you have some really amazing faculty there who are consider themselves more postmodern. So take it with a grain of salt. My master program had two main focuses. On one side, it was really focused on the MRI approach and brief therapy. The other side was really emphasized social constructionism. And I remember for a long time, I wanted to be postmodern. I think eventually I got to a point where I thought, no, there's some things that I believe to be true. Um, and so now I think of myself as a postmodernly informed modernist. And I kind of trust that for myself because I feel like when people believe that they don't hold any core uh, views of things being true, then 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 they're not being reflective about it. I'd rather acknowledge that I believe some things to be true, and then be mindful about the impact that they might have. That's my own little thought. Okay, so postmodern therapies. Before we jump in, let's just have you ask yourselves a few questions. These are questions that came from a textbook on supervising people from a postmodern approach. But I think these are useful questions for us to be asking ourselves. So think about a particular case that you're working on, a client. What do you think? What do you think the client's understanding is about the situation, about what's going on, about the experience with you in therapy, but mostly about what the difficulty that they're coming in to talk to you about? And then what understandings do you have? I think of those as like both of you have a story and you're coming in, and sometimes the stories between people are useful and sometimes they're less so. So if it's working, then great. But if not, what possible new understandings might be useful? Like there's an infinite number of ways you can think about any given presenting problem. How else might you think about it? And then what other questions could have been asked that you haven't asked? Like if you really were to just shift out of one mindset into a different mindset about what is going on, what kinds of questions would you ask differently? And what would that open up? Of course, as you're going through and asking these kinds of questions, there shouldn't be any sort of preconceived answers. Let's jump in and ask a few others. What positions are you taking during therapy? Like, are you taking sort of a more rescuing position? Are you taking more of a liberator position? Are you taking an educator position? Are you like whatever? Like, what have you just thought of those as different masks you're trying on until you find one that's useful? If you're stuck, you're probably stuck in a story that you're telling about the client. If you were to refuse the call to diagnose this client, what kinds of new relationships might you step into with her? Like think about one that you think like, okay, this is a blank kind of case. Even if it's not like a DSM diagnosis, but you're thinking about like, oh, okay, this person's um, I don't know, a stubborn person, or this person's um, a careless person. Or this is it could be a diagnosis. It could be like this is someone who suffers from hyperactivity, or this is a person who such and such. How else could you think about it? What do you call this dance you are within the family? Like if you were to go a little bit meta and look at yourself interacting with the client, what would you call the dance? And is it a dance that's helpful, or is it one that's got limitations? What position did you feel yourself called into? Like when you first started with them, what did you feel like maybe you were meant to do or needed to do? And then how else could you think about the role that you're going to have with that family? Okay, these are kind of the mentality that captures what a postmodern approach is. Let's talk about some more specifics. A few key things from a postmodern approach is, well, first of all, the idea of social construction, which is basically, in short terms, meanings are constructed through social interactions and consensus. Like, yeah, we all decide okay, the way we're all acting in this class. We've all come to some sort of agreement. This is how we're going to interact. But there's also an infinite other ways that we could have defined the roles. It's the idea of multiple truths. I guess this is why my favorite talk remains the danger of a single story, because it sort of captures this. Look at the TED talk, Danger of the Single Story. I probably already forced it on you. I can't remember. But there's the idea of multiple truths. There's always new interpretations that can be expressed, multiple perspectives that develop new meanings. And when you're talking with clients and you help them just consider other possible ways of thinking about truth, the truths of their lives, it can open up new ways for them to interact and then resolve the difficulties that they're facing. So, from a postmodern approach, the idea of pathology and diagnosing are really just kind of inconsistent for the most part. I mean, people find ways to do it, but on the at the core level, it's probably pretty arguable that those are inconsistent. So it's sort of, if you're coming from a postmodern approach, you avoid labeling, which is a pretty hard thing to do as a human because it's sort of our natural tendency to do so. But as soon as you put a label on something, then the thinking stops. So yeah, try some new labels. Again, from this approach, you try to take a non-expert position, like you're not coming in with the only knowledge, and you're recognizing that your client has knowledge, or the team members, or many other people have knowledge. It does tune into a lot about the concept of hierarchy differently than like Minuchin would do, though. It's mostly aimed at reducing the experience of hierarchy, particularly between clients and therapists. And one of the ways it does that is by reducing the tendency to say this is the way it is. You're much more tentative in your language, and you use terms that show that there could be many different views about this issue. And you really want to avoid subjugating or marginalizing the client's knowledge and their experiences. From a postmodern perspective, reality or truth is made up of interpretive stories. We're all sort of born into a set of stories. Think about your family, think about your cultures, think about your town, your nation, your whatever. You're born into stories that were existing before, and then they ended up having an impact on you, for good or for not good. So part of the process of a postmodern approach would probably just becoming more aware that you're living in a storied world, and you could live by a different story if it's not useful for you. And those stories grow out of conversations between anyone, but between therapists and clients. Therapists from this approach really will listen with an open mind. They are active and facilitators and inquirers. Like, they're not sitting back necessarily passive, just like Rogerian therapy. They're not just sort of saying They're putting out their ideas. They're sort of engaging in dialogues with the clients, as an active force. Therapists can help clarify meanings and revise beliefs based on the client's lead. They're sort of trying to follow the client's lead. And the therapist maintains faith that the client, that they have these within them, these abilities to solve the problems. There's competencies that they have that can be used to address the challenges that the client is facing within them already. Some of the things they might do from a postmodern approach is to externalize and deconstruct the problem. I'll talk more about that in a second. The person, for sure, from this perspective, is not the problem. The problem's the problem. And so a therapist from this approach would try to find moments where the client's not being lived by the story or by the problem. So they're looking for unique outcomes. They might talk about the future, about what it will be like for the client when their life isn't being lived by the problem, and they're trying to get away from problem-saturated language. And they use language in a conscious way to sort of say, like, okay, when this is over and when this is done, when you've figured this out, when you're through the path, you're just assuming change is going to happen. They're also trying to help the clients to find a social context for expressing the new story. And then finally, they want to describe their experience in fresh language in which they are no longer fused with the problem. So it's a sort of whole language sort of effort gained in order to help disconnect people from an identity that is problem saturated. Okay, let's talk about one of my favorite postmodern approaches. Well, the work of Michael White. This narrative means to therapeutic ends. It's by Michael White and David Epstein. If you haven't read it, this is one of the best books. What I like about it is it has some real concrete things that you can do using writing with clients. Check it out. So there's lots of people, and I know you in your program you focus mostly on, or a lot. This is what I think, at least. This is my story that you focus a lot on postmodern approaches there. One of my favorites, though, is Michael White. Um, Therapy is about co-authoring the meaning and knowledge which are identified and created through collaboration between the therapist and the client. Some of the stuff that I particularly liked about Michael White's work is his use of written language. Oh, but before I jump into that, I got ahead of myself. One of the ways I've thought about all of these things is like if you imagined each of these little bubbles being a story in a person's life. So maybe you have a client that comes in and they say, okay, so I was born to a single parent. I didn't do well in school. I eventually dropped out in high school. I started using drugs, and then I ended up in prison. And those things might be something that happened in a person's life. But the thing is, that's not all that's happened. There's so many other things that could be given, stories that could be given airtime. Like maybe there was a grandmother that was a very positive influence in their lives and a force for good. Maybe they were really good at artistic expression and they just had a natural talent for that. And then maybe in the group home that they lived in, they became sort of a leader among the other youths and showed great resiliency at that time. Like the opportunity to explore and expand stories outside the pathology story and thicken the story into one that includes more strengths and unique outcomes is endless. Like there's so many other things that could be given air, and the idea is that the more air you give to the more positive stories sort of the other aspects of a person's life, the more options. And I guess it doesn't always have to be just positive. It's just you're expanding the singular story that they're telling so that they can have a more expansive story and thus different ways to react and interact. Okay, so the idea is like you're talking to someone about problems. In the shadows of this failure, other knowledges of life and practices and living might be identified and richly described and expanded upon. So one of the things Michael White was known for is externalizing the problem. And basically this is, you come up with a name for a problem, you give that force a sort of personality and attribute oppressive intentions to it, and then you get the clients to fight against it. So for example, I might say to a couple, so it's kind of like a dark fog somehow found its way into your home, and even though there's some really beautiful things in your relationships, the fog has found a way to sort of block it so that you miss those in each other. And I don't know exactly what you did, but last weekend you were able to find a way to kick the fog out for the entire weekend. But little by little, it's used to living in your home, and it finds ways back in. Tell me about that. Like, how did you get it out of your house and out of your relationship, so that you could finally really see each other for the first time in a long time? And then, what are its tricks? Like, if you two wanted to really fight against this fog, what are some of the tricks that it might use to get back into your relationship, and what could you do to combat those? Those are examples. One of the things I really did like about Michael White is that, and his book, The Written Means to Therapeutic Ends, is that he built a pretty good argument that when people see something in print, they take it more seriously. It carries a power to it that just words spoken might not. So, for example, maybe he would write a letter to someone who's not participating in therapy and ask them questions that would sort of create a bind that would make them either want to write back or might make them want to come into to therapy. I love that he would do like post-session notes, like post-session thoughts. Like maybe you would write and say, you know what, I thought about it. How you talked about how last July you only you didn't use drugs for the majority of the month. How did you do it, and what were you doing in July that was so powerful? I'd love to hear more about that when we meet next week. It's a way to sort of continue the power that happened in a session and have it go out there in between sessions and so forth. Maybe he'd get certificates for people who've overcome difficulties. There's just so many different ways to use written means to sort of strengthen your therapy intentions.
Sometimes I'm worried by the ubiquitous pontification of nefarious troglodytes. Okay, keep this to yourselves. But one of my critiques about postmodernism isn't with the ideas, but sort of a culture that I find in postmodern groups. And it's sort of this elitist language where a lot of the time is spent talking about the nuances of language. There's something about it that I find a little bit elitist. Maybe because I come from my dad cleaned toilets. I cleaned toilets put myself through school. There's sort of this view of academia as sort of being separate and disconnected from the reality of people. So sometimes I think about, I've seen some therapies done from a postmodern approach where I feel like people are just trying to show off how many big words they know, and I don't know why that is. It's a conundrum to me.